I don't need a mic for PA here, but this is to pick it up on the video, so you can all hear me okay, I assume, in the room here. Well, what I want to talk with you about today, as my title suggests here, is Spring Mill and its railroads, with a kind of hint about what the theme might be with the mention of Cincinnati, which I'll of course get to. And the picture you're seeing here is a picture of the current CSX railroad. And on both sides of the track there is Spring Mill State Park. And this could be titled, A Railroad Runs Through It. That's how close that railroad is to Spring Mill Village. And yet, a lot of talk about Spring Mill Village and its decline talks about the railroads kind of passing Spring Mill by, leaving Spring Mill behind. Even the best current general book that we have by my colleague Jim Madison says that. Here's a picture from his book, published just in 2014. And it says the usual thing. It says Hamer's Mill in Lawrence County was the center of a pioneer community until it was bypassed by the railroads. All of the writers about Spring Mill use terms something like that, bypass, pass by. What do they mean by that? Because in fact, railroads essentially came to Spring Mill. Both of the railroads were very, very close. One of them was as close as you can get a railroad to the village. So what I'd like to suggest to you tonight is that the problem for Spring Mill Village as an economic place was not that the railroads left Spring Mill behind and didn't come to Spring Mill, but that they did. And it was, the problem for Spring Mill was not the absence of railroads, but the actual proximity of the railroads. And that'll be sort of the thesis of my talk tonight. So let me do this in kind of 6 chapters here. I'll first tell a little bit about the village before the railroads came, talk about the railroads a bit, how the proprietors of the village responded to the railroad's presence and why that failed. And then talk about other places, particularly nearby places, that prospered because they were crossroads of railroads and had other advantages. And then finally, I'll end a little bit with the crossroads of Indiana and America in the railroad age, Indianapolis, and then a little bit about the afterlife of the railroad age. So that's what I'll do here. So here's Spring Mill Village in the first year of its opening in 1930 after it was restored. I like this picture because it shows a road, and Spring Mill had a road that ran through it, and it's gone now, and you can't quite picture what it was like for this to be a village that actually had an active road running through it. But if you look at the maps from the pre-railroad era, you can get a sense of what this was like, this village. This is a postal map of Ohio and Indiana from 1839. And if we focus in on southern Indiana, it shows, what's good about this map is it shows roads, it shows post roads, and it describes what sort of roads they were. And the main road that ran through Lawrence County from north to south is, we can see here when I focus way in, zoom in on Lawrence, is noted on this map as a four-horse post coach road. So it could handle a substantial equipage for postal delivery. And it's essentially the road that evolved in various ways into Old Highway 37. It connected Indianapolis to Fredonia on the Ohio River. And one of the crossroads in Lawrence County was Spring Mill. The best post road in the county came up from Paoli, from the Ohio River, Paoli to Spring Mill, went from Spring Mill, crossed the river about where Old Palestine was, went on to Bedford, up to Bloomington, Martinsville, and Indianapolis. These roads with the dotted lines are 2-horse coach roads, a little bit not quite as good. And then just the straight lines are one-horse or sulky roads. They couldn't handle a coach at all for postal delivery. So Spring Mill was on a road. It was on several roads, in fact. This is a map of the county from 1873, and you can't see it from where you are, so I'm going to just show you the southern part of the county. And it shows the transportation network in 1873, just to give you an overview here. We've got the White River running through the county. We've got a lot of roads. By 1873, the two railroads were in place and crossed at Mitchell here. And here's Spring Mill. Spring Mill is a crossroads of roads, and it's right by, well, it's very close to one railroad, and right exactly by the other. These squares are mile square sections. This is Marion Township, and you can see that area a little more clearly with the White River up here, a couple miles north, which was used for transportation. We've got the one railroad, the other railroad, and Spring Mill is right there, focusing even more highly. So the roads is a crossroad. Now roads, the main road from the south, the Paola, comes into right near the rim of the canyon, where the cave is. It goes around the rim of the canyon or through it. It goes down what we call, actually I'll show you that so you know where we are. This is the modern boundaries of Spring Mill State Park that I grew in. But the old road, you go down into the canyon by what's now called the Stagecoach Trail, past all the houses and the key of the grist mill, Cambridge Cave. Here's Donaldson Cave. And then up the hill, up the side of the hill, across the railroad track, and on to Bedford. Here's a modern map, a current map, that shows how those roads look now. But the state park seems so isolated to us now because all those roads are stepped off. But the old road, the main road, is now Spring Haven Road that comes up and it's stepped off there. Used to go all the way through. But some of the park roads are the old roads, the ones that go to the park. And when it went up the hill and over across the railroad track and on to Bedford, the remnant of that is Hardman Road. It's in park property now in North Park. So that's the setting of Spring Mill Village at the end of the railroad age and the beginning of change of railroad. One of the characters that was entrepreneur the Spring Mill Village, the owner of the property in Bedford, that the remnant of that is Hardman Road. It just ends at State Park property now on the north side. So that's village at the end of the railroad age, and that was entrepreneur and owner at the Spring Mill Village. The owner of the property and the mill was Hugh Hamer, and this is his portrait. And he loved railroads. Everybody sort of loved railroads, and he thought the coming of the railroads was going to be his salvation of his business. And you can kind of tell that on this of the area. Mill. Here's the White River, and here's the Ohio and Mississippi Railroad, and very close to the mill, just as it is today. And all these Hamers subdivided their properties along the railroad, obviously thinking they're going to get something out of the fact that this railroad is coming through, which they kind of didn't. This is from the early years of Spring Mill's restoration, and I love this picture because I think it's great that when they restored the park, the mill, they restored the village. They made it look like a village. They put a road through it. When you came to the park in the 1930s, you drove down the road that's now called the Stagecoach Trail. You drove your car right through the village, and you could drive it right up the side of the hill on the north side of the canyon, cross the railroad track, and go out of the park that way. This is from 1933 or something like that. This picture was taken in 1920, about 20 years or more after the village had been abandoned and was completely uninhabited. There's a couple of visitors watching. Here's the road, the same road that you saw. And going across on the ridge is the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. And if these people were there for any length of time, they would have heard the railroad go by. So there's a railroad up there, and the town is dead. Now, why is that? That's the thing that I want to explore with you here. It's still there. The railroad's still there, and the park is a park. I took this picture from a park road with the railroad running just through the woods a little bit there. You can still hear the railroad go by. So let's talk about the railroads that affected Spring Mill's history. First, a little bit about railroads in 1850. It's an incredible boom time for railroading in the whole country. You can look at some of these numbers, and I want to focus quickly on Indiana. In 1850, Indiana had 228 miles of railroads. 10 years later, it had 2,163 miles of railroads. So in one decade, 2,000 miles of railroads were laid in the state of Indiana. That's a hell of a lot of infrastructure to be built in the course of one decade. And the building went on and on in this state until we had, in 1890, something like 6,000 miles of railroads in the state. You can see this graphically with a map. Here's Indiana and Ohio and Illinois railroads in 1850. The only railroad that was completed by 1850 in Indiana was the Madison and Indianapolis Railroad. 10 years later, all three of these states are crisscrossed by railroads, including the two railroads that came through southern Indiana and our area, with Spring Mill right there at the crossroads of those two. This map is a 1858 railroad map. That's a good one of the whole country. You can, all these black lines, you can see how what we now call the Midwest, the Ohio, the Old Northwest, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois was the headquarters, the focus of railroad building in the 1850s. Here we're looking a little more closely. And Indiana by 1858 is crisscrossed by railroads, including the two that I'm talking about tonight, the Ohio and Mississippi Railroad from Cincinnati to St. Louis, and the New Albany and Salem Railroad that went on all the way through Bedford and the western part of the state to Michigan City. So these are the two railroads. And these are two advertisements from the late 1850s. The New Albany and Salem Railroad, which came through here, I think came to Bedford by 1853, changed its name to the Louisville, New Albany, and Chicago Railroad by the end of the decade. And that's kind of an aspirational name. They didn't go either to Louisville or Chicago, as some of you may know. And later they threw Indianapolis in instead of New Albany, and they didn't go there either until later. And so it's, they thought they were thinking big, and they eventually did make connections in the age of the Monon to Chicago and Louisville and Indianapolis. The other railroad that we're talking about, the East-West Railroad that came through here, was the Ohio and Mississippi, which advertised its gauge, its broad gauge. They didn't know how to spell gauge, and probably that's not the only mistake about broad gauge that they made, because it turned out to be a mistake. Broad gauge, in this case, was 6 feet between the rails instead of what was becoming the standard gauge of 4 feet, 8.5 inches. But they're aspirational as well, as you'll see. So let's look at the first one is the North-South Railroad, the Louisville, New Albany, and Chicago. All the railroads loved their locomotives and had lithographs made in the 1850s, and this is one of the early locomotives. This is the railroad map from 1858 of Indiana, and it's a good one, and it's a good one to focus on Lawrence because, as you'll see in our area here, you can see the roads as well as the railroads, and you can see the cross-hatching of mile squares, so you can get a sense of distances here. But I've zoomed in here, part of Jackson County, part of Orange County, Washington, and then Lawrence. And the New Albany and Salem Railroad coming up from New Albany was always planned to go past Salem in Washington. And in Lawrence, the little town of Bono had big plans, and you can see why, of the railroad going through Bono, or very near Bono on the Ohio River here, because it's the logical straight line between Salem and Bedford, and then on up. Instead, the railroad took a jog to Orleans, and it's usually said that was for selling securities to boosters in Orleans, and that's probably part of it. But it also makes some sense to stay away topographically from Bono, which is a high bluff above the river. But at any rate, Bono was left high and dry with this railroad choice. But it helped Spring Mill if railroads were good for a place like Spring Mill, because here's Spring Mill, and this railroad was a lot closer, only 2 miles from Spring Mill, where with Bono, if it had gone that route, it would have been about 4, 5, 6 miles, and with Sugar Creek being a rough road to haul stuff from Spring Mill to Bono. This is the way the Monon, as it later was called, eventually ended up with its main tracks from New Albany to Michigan City, but then the addition of lines to Chicago and Indianapolis as well. So that was just 2 miles from Spring Mill, and close enough could have been farther away than it was, but it's pretty close. The other railroad, the one from east and west, is the one I want to say a little bit more about, that crossed the New Albany and Salem Railroad. This is the Ohio and Mississippi Railroad, and it's a creature of boosters from Cincinnati. I'll show you another railroad map here from 1852, and this is very much an aspirational kind of map of plans and ideas as much for railroads. Look at southern Indiana here. We've got railroads by 1852 that were already being constructed, such as the New Albany and Salem Railroad that was making its way to Orleans and on its way to Bedford. But plans for the East-West Railroad in as late as 1852, the Ohio and Mississippi, were still in flux. And the best idea, some planners thought, to get from Brownstown, which is where the railroad would come in Jackson County, was to go pretty much straight to Bedford and never cross the White River at all, the East Fork of the White River at all. And so this is an idea for a route that railroad might take. It didn't, but it would have been far, far, far away from Spring Mill if it had. My favorite railroad here is the Columbus, Nashville, and Bloomington Railroad, which was actually, part of that was surveyed even, but it was none of it was ever built. And Bloomington, which is my town, that's where I'm from, didn't get a second railroad until 1906. But all these promoters like Bloomington were promoting these kinds of railroads as early as the early 1850s. Another 1852 railroad map is this one. It's a mess for you to see, but this is another one that shows the possibility of a railroad from Brownstown. This one from Brownstown to Orleans. And I'll zoom in on this. Here's the White River, just to get your bearings here. Here's Hamer's Mill. Here's Lawrenceport, and here's Bono. And the plan on this map for a railroad was to bring it out of the White River Valley through Bono and down to Orleans, and to make Orleans a major railroad crossroads. Now, when you see this map and you think, remember the Bono people thought the New Albany and Salem might come through. Now they think that the Ohio and Mississippi, I mean, they think, God, Bono is just the crossroads of America. And if you've ever been to Bono, you know, it's just not even there anymore, but they had their plans. How this railroad actually came is a fascinating story, and I'll give you a glimpse of it here with an 1873 map. This is the whole county, and I'll focus in here. Another plan, and the plan that came closest to being carried out, that was the favored plan of O.M. Mitchell, who was the main engineer on the Ohio and Mississippi, not engineer, but planner and fundraiser and brains of the surveys, a mathematician and professor and booster from Cincinnati. He imagined bringing the railroad mostly down from Brownstown along the river, but then coming out of the White River Valley and cutting through somewhere near what Devil's Backbone or farther east to get into the valley of Guthrie Creek, and then follow the Guthrie Creek Valley, and then come out of that and all the way stay on the north side of the river, cross Salt Creek south of Bedford, and never cross the East Fork of the White River. That was his favored plan. That didn't happen. What did happen is what's shown on this map. They stayed in the valley of the White River and then came out of that valley along the valley of Mill Creek to Hamer's Mill. So this is just a godsend, presumably, to Hugh Hamer, that they not only came near Spring Mill, but they used his creek valley to get out of the White River Valley and went right by his mill village. Here's this map from 1873 that shows this. To do this, they had to cut two tunnels, build a bridge, and do a lot of rock work at Mill Creek. This map is a topo map, a topographical map that shows this better, how this worked. Here's Fort Ritner, here's the county line, and the railroad hugs the floodplain. The white is the floodplain of the White River, and it stays about 20 feet above the floodplain by hugging the bluffs. Comes along here, they cut a tunnel through there that we call Big Tunnel, and it just hugs the bluffs around here all the way, goes past Tunnelton. Comes over here, they do another tunnel here called Little Tunnel, and then they cross the river there. Big Tunnel is still in use. Here it is. Here's some work being done on it in 1908. It was improved and lined. And here's the building of Little Tunnel in 1857, which was one of the last projects on the railroad. And here's what Little Tunnel looks like today. It's not a tunnel, it's just a big cut. They blew the lid off of it in 1899, or to use railroad jargon, they daylighted it. And that's the rock cut that was Little Tunnel until 1899. So here's that area. here's Little Tunnel, cross the river, hug the edge of the floodplain and at Rivervale, and then make a turn here to come up the valley of Mill Creek, out of the valley, and on to what came to be called the Mitchell Plain. And to do that, they needed to come up about 160 feet or so in about 4 miles, which is exactly what O.M. Mitchell promised the backers he could do, that he could do this railroad with a grade of no more than 40 feet a mile, which is less than 1%. But this is still kind of a tough hill to come up. And if I focus on, or zoom in here, the original track makes this turn. The reason why it shows on this map is because that's where the road goes down there. The county road makes that turn. And then it was improved in the 1920s or 30s to make them more gradual. Going at a 1% grade uphill is about as much as you want a mainline railroad to do. But to do it after you've made a sharp curve is not so good. You don't have any momentum, you're slow. Coming down could be even worse, coming down a hill and then hitting a sharp turn, so they improved that. This is what the cut through the rock at Mill Creek looks like today. It's just, there it is, it's the old cut. Here's another shot from the Mill Creek cut. This is the last work that was done on this railroad in 1857. And then it crossed the creek, Mill Creek, on a bridge like this. This isn't the earliest one, but it's an abandoned bridge from, I think, the early 20th century there, about 20 feet above the floodplain, above the creek or above the river. And this is what that cut looks like today when it was moved up a little bit up the grade. This is how the railroad crosses Mill Creek now, not a bridge just 20 feet above the creek, but a big fill that's already the idea here was to begin the rise as soon as possible after they cross the White River, and then make a gradual run up the hill at Mill Creek, past Spring Mill Village, and go on to the Mitchell Plain, which is about 685 feet. So the White River runs about 500 feet above sea level, and the railroad ran about 520, and Mitchell is 685. So here that again is the big improved turn. So when this was completed at Mill Creek, it was big news. Here's a story from the New York Tribune. On Wednesday last, a huge fragment of blasted rock was rolled out of the through cut of the Ohio and Mississippi Railroad this side of Mitchell. And at 20 minutes past 3, Daniel D. Page spiked the last rail in the 340 miles of iron road connecting Cincinnati and St. Louis. At a festival given in commemoration of the event, Mr. Barlow gave the second sentiment, the health of Aspinall and his New York associates, who came forward in the hour of imminent peril and secured to the West the completion of her greatest road. Those are the New York capitalists that Mitchell pried the last amount of money that they needed. It was mainly a Cincinnati thing, but he went to New York and London to get the last of the money that they needed to finish this at Mill Creek. There he is. There's O.M. Mitchell, Ormsby. And he died of disease during the Civil War. He's in his Civil War uniform. Quite an interesting guy. Many of you know about him. He was a general in the war. He was a college professor, of course, the greatest of all jobs. That's what and an astronomer. I mean, one of his legacies is the Cincinnati observatory with an antique telescope that was the second largest refracting telescope in the country when it was put in. Another key figure in this, who looks like the perfect 1850s guy, is Edward Deering Mansfield, who was a great booster of the city of Cincinnati. He was a writer, a journalist, a publisher, and a promoter, absolutely as much as he could promote, of the Ohio and Mississippi Railroad. And he wrote about this great event at Mill Creek in his trade journal, the Railroad Record. He put it this way: in a commercial point of view, this is a great event for Cincinnati. It completes the great chain of roads which unite her with the East and West and restores to her that position of commercial importance in which her river facilities, in the absence of railroads, had placed her. And that was the aim here. Cincinnati was the queen city of the West and was the gateway to the West, and the railroad age might steal that away from them. And the Cincinnati people were obsessed with being leaders of making Cincinnati connected to the West, meaning St. Louis in particular, the way they had been during the steamboat age. Here's Cincinnati just right before the railroad age. This is a wonderful, just part of a wonderful daguerreotype that was made in 1848 of the waterfront of Cincinnati. And most of these buildings along there, you can't see what they are, but they're associated with shipbuilding, with steam engine building, with boiler making. Cincinnati, because of its role as a riverboat city, was also becoming a manufacturing city. And the aim of this railroad was to, as Mitchell and Mansfield and others put it, was to make this area between Cincinnati and through Indiana tributary to Cincinnati. That was their word. Indiana was to be tributary to the city of Cincinnati. And that's what the railroad age would be. Here's a scene from the 1870s where the railroad is wedded to the river with shipping on both the river and the railroads. And that's the Roebling Bridge in the background that's still there and was opened in the 1860s. One of the manufacturing businesses of Cincinnati that illustrates Cincinnati's role as a growing manufacturing city is this one, Niles and Company, which, here's an ad from the 1850s of the kind of work that they did. Cincinnati was becoming a major manufacturing city of machines, particularly machines that made machines like lathes and planing machines, but also marine and stationary engines, steam engines, boilers of every description, heavy forgings, iron and brass castings, et cetera, and including very quickly in the 1840s and 50s, locomotives. And the first locomotives on the Ohio and Mississippi Railroad were made by Niles and Company of Cincinnati, and here's one of those, an illustration of one. And also Moore and Richardson, a locomotive manufacturer of Cincinnati, also supplied in locomotives to the Ohio and Mississippi Railroad. The idea here was to make sure that Cincinnati was connected and controlled the connection as much as possible to the east by making this connection to the west, to St. Louis. This, and the railroad that they really wanted to be connected with in the 1850s. This is an 1855 map of New York and Erie Railroad. And if I focus in on Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, you can see, well, first, actually, the main lines of the Erie Railroad are New York, across New York to Lake Erie, to Buffalo, but the main line of the Erie to Lake Erie and the Lake Shore Railroad, that's the one that the Cincinnati people wanted to be connected with. That was a broad gauge railroad, and they thought that by building their railroad as a broad gauge, it would make this route the route to the west, to Lake Erie, down to Cincinnati, and across to St. Louis. This is how they imagined it, and so did, for a while at least, the Erie, because this is an Erie map, and it shows the connection that they wanted to make from Cincinnati to St. Louis. This is just Indiana here, but 13 cents on to St. Louis. They were worried about Chicago, of course, and Chicago in the end did eclipse Cincinnati as a railroad center. But they were also worried about Indianapolis, and the railroad line that they were concerned about there is the railroad line that came to be known as the Bellefontaine, which goes through Bellefontaine, Ohio, from Cleveland through Bellefontaine to Indianapolis to Terre Haute and then to St. Louis via Alton, Illinois. That railroad, the Bellefontaine, or the B line, did become a major trunk line from Cleveland to Indianapolis, and probably did eclipse the Ohio and Mississippi for travel through to St. Louis. So here's an ad from 1857 from the Ohio Mississippi Railroad, and you can see for passenger service, it's the New York to St. Louis that they were promoting, not just Cincinnati to St. Louis, but New York to St. Louis via Cincinnati, and that was the key thing. And it says it's the only broad gauge railroad in the West. It says broad gauge saloon cars through from Cincinnati to St. Louis without change, and with few stops as well for passenger service. And then freight service, they were interested in the agriculture on the way. So how did Spring Mill do with these railroads? I mean, I've been talking to you about New York, St. Louis, Cleveland, Cincinnati. How about Spring Mill? How did they fit into this? Well, I'll tell you a little bit about that. I don't think Hugh Hamer did much at all to try to figure out how to make his enterprise work in the railroad age. But his successor, Jonathan Turley, who is pictured here, did. And he did a couple of things, a number of things. The first thing he did was he actually decided to modernize the mill. Some mills, small mills, had done that. Beck's Mill, for example, in Washington County, they put in new equipment and kept going for a while. What did he get? Well, I've looked at his papers, his business papers are on deposit at the State Library in Indianapolis, and they're kind of a mess, and it's hard to know exactly what he bought. But one thing for sure that he bought was a turbine, a water turbine. Miller's wanted as much as possible to get rid of those clunky old, inefficient, upright, vertical water wheels. So he got that out of there and installed a Victor turbine manufactured in Dayton, Ohio by Stillwell and Beers. And he at least signed a promissory note. And I think he paid the first of the 3 installments, and whether he paid the rest, I don't know. But he did install this turbine because, well, here's what a water turbine looks like. And I have a whole talk and some writing about milling, so I won't go into that here, but I'll share that with you if you're interested in the history of power. I'll put you on to something that I've recently written about. But here's a turbine flume, a turbine case, and here's probably a picture kind of what a mill with an encased turbine looked like, with a wooden flume delivering water to the turbine and working with belts instead of gearing. We know he installed this because the only picture I've ever seen of the wheel side of the mill from the 19th century is this one, which was taken, a photograph in 1901 after the place was abandoned. But you can see there's no vertical water wheel, no overshot water wheel here. We've got the familiar flume here. But focus in on tight here. This is a turbine flume. This is a pipe, an iron pipe that operates the turbine. Now, when they restored the mill, there's no talk about equipment. So all of this at some point disappeared and possibly never was actually bought or was later sold or repossessed or something like that. So whatever he installed to try to do a better job of milling didn't work out very well. When they restored the mill, they completely did away with any remnant of the turbine kit and restored it to its more 1820s and 30s look they didn't restore it, they reconstructed an overshot water wheel. That's a current picture today, but the turbine was installed right in there. He bought some other equipment from a mill supplier in Salem named Redfield, and he signed a promissory note for $890. And this was grain milling equipment that he at least corresponded with Redfield about. He may have installed some. My own sense is that I think that probably this was later sold or repossessed. There's not a whole lot of indication that he paid off some of these notes, and he was supposedly in debt by the time he died. He also corresponded with a mill supplier in Louisville who specialized in distilleries, and that was his second enterprise, is still a distillery. And here it is, a picture of the building in the 1880s. And that probably did pretty well. There's evidence of that in the papers that for a while at least he did pretty well with his distilling. He did some whiskey, but he mainly seemed to specialize in brandy, peach, and apple, which was fairly common around here. And he got there's a lot of letters ordering his brandy. Here's one from the Ulitic Saloon here in Bedford, where he says, "Dear sir, I have an order from a customer for 5 gallons of old apple brandy. The older I can get, the better. Please let me know what age brandy you have and price." So he sold a lot of brandy. He paid his taxes on the liquor that he sold. And the State Park Service was going to restore this distillery, in fact, in the early days. This is a postcard from the 1930s when the idea was to turn this back into a still. But they didn't really do that, although it still is there, but it's now also the wood shop. It still says distillery, but it's also the wood shop. I put him in because he's my son. That's a cameo. He was the woodworker in Springville when I took that picture. No restoration of the distilling. And this is an intriguing letter from 1887 where a contractor and furnisher of mills is asking about equipment. And he says, "Where is your mill situated? What machines are therein? Will you sell the mill without a distillery? What price and terms?" Yours sincerely, S.H. Stout. So he had seen an ad apparently and had decided and my guess is that somebody who's a furnisher is buying this equipment, is looking for equipment to buy. And that may be why there was no equipment really there when the state took it over. Another business that he got into was making lime. This is a lime kiln. This is a current picture that is on the property of the state park. Burning of lime, heating it, heating limestone and chemically turning it into lime was an enterprise that he got into. Here's a quarry area where the limestone was dug out. we're back to this map that shows the park property. He and Hostetler, Sam Hostetler, had kilns up in this area where Hostetler owned property. Turley had taken over the Hamer properties, and he had some kind of he was like an executor or something for Timothy Hickson's estate. And so he had interests in all of this property. And they were in the lime business, and they loaded lime onto the railroad cars at what was called Hostetler's Switch. And it was somewhere along there. The Hostetlers also had a steam sawmill along the road. Remember, this is the road through the village, up the hill, and then all of that had access to the railroad with a switch there. So the railroad came right by the village and stopped there if there was some reason for it to stop. This is a railroad map from 1878 that shows the station stops on the Ohio and Mississippi Railroad, and it shows the station stops as Fort Brittner, Tunnelton, Rivervale, Hamers, and then Mitchell. So it was listed on a railroad map as a state. The Department of Geology and Natural Resources, as late as 1911, which has a table of the stations on the B&O Railroad, which was the successor to the Ohio and Mississippi. And it shows these are the Lawrence County stations on the B&O, Fort Brittner, Littleton, Hamer is there between Rivervale and Mitchell. And there's a number of other places where Hamer crops up as a station stop on the railroad. This is an official state railroad map from 1906 that still shows Hamers between Rivervale and Mitchell. And this is the best of all from my point of view. It's a geological map from the 1920s that actually, and here's the valley here's Donaldson Cave, Hamers Cave, here's the village, and it shows a switch there if I come in. Here's, get your bearings here. Here's Hamer Cave, here's Hamers Cave, so here's the village, Donaldson Cave. This is where the lake is now. And right there on the railroad is a switch that presumably it's in the right area to be Hostetler's Switch or the Hamer's stop on the railroad. And they loaded lime there. But it turned out that the lime lands that Turley had an interest in were no good. He dealt with a lime company, a limestone company from Salem, and they did core samplings and said, forget it, we're not picking up the option. And lime, that was another bust for Turley in business. And I've looked for remnants of Hostetler's Switch, and somewhere in this picture, somewhere, I've been able to find it. He tried one more thing before he died. He bought some lottery tickets, and these are in his papers too. He didn't cash them, and he died in 1896. This ad appeared in the newspapers in 1899. It says Hamer's Cave is famous as a kind of tourist attraction. Jonathan Turley's place. It has a fine, never-failing water power, it says, and it has several dwellings. It has farmlands and timber and so forth that's to be sold. It's owned by a cement and lime company that he eventually evolved into Lehigh, a Mitchell company. This is in Louisville, but a Mitchell company owned this property. They didn't use it for making lime, but they did end up using the water, if not the water power. On the other hand, at the crossing of these two railroads, things did happen, and this is the Mitchell crossing, and this is the current view of Mitchell's crossing. And Mitchell became a city in 1878. And there are a lot of things that work well with a small town and a railroads, but the one that I want to mention is this one here. This is the Kelly flour mill in 1878, right along the railroad track. And this was, so it wasn't that small-scale milling was abandoned. You still could do it, but Spring Mill had lost its advantage with its small water power, and that it was better to run and cheaper and more efficient to run even a flour mill in the city of Mitchell, which was a steam flour mill, probably looked like that, where the key power was steam. And the reason for that is that railroads took away grain from local millers. They raised the price of agricultural products, but they really lowered the cost of coal. And so bringing coal in was the key thing that affected small businesses that needed power. And so it was the growth of the small, simple, dependable, fairly reliable, cheap steam engine and cheap coal that caused a small water power like Spring Mill, which is lose its comparative advantage. And it was better to run a flour mill in Mitchell than it was to run one just 2 miles away with water power. This is a Sandborn fire insurance map of the Kelly Mill from 1894, and it lists all the equipment that he had, and it was pretty up to date. Roller mills, purifiers. It was a pretty decent flour mill in the 1890s. He sold, that was sold to William Matthew and his son John, and they kept milling wheat in the 1890s and in the 20th century here in Mitchell. They didn't know how to spell class, but they had first class flour nonetheless. And the Hostettlers brought their lumber yard in too from out there by the village. This is right by the railroad tracks in Mitchell, and they were better off being near the coal shed than they were to be out there by Spring Mill Village. I like this picture because it just shows the importance of coal. This is about a 1920 picture of a Monon train in Mitchell. Locomotives burned the coal and they brought the coal. And this is a Monon train delivering coal to the Heisey Brothers coal yards at Mitchell in the 1920s. And then, of course, Lehigh becomes a big business in Mitchell, partly because good lime quarry for raw materials north of Mitchell were developed, but also it's coal again. And this is a postcard that by 1915, Lehigh was burning 16,000 tons of coal a month. So that's a good deal of power in their case that needed to be generated with coal. 16,000 tons a month by 1915. Now another crossroads that is revealing as well is this one. You know what this one is? This is Seymour, and this is a current picture of the old B&O or Ohio and Mississippi Railroad running this way, and then this is the railroad, the Jeffersonville line to Indianapolis. That was a better railroad than the Monon. It went directly to Indianapolis and Louisville, and it made Seymour kind of better railroad town. And it also was the beginning, really, of the connection, or this era, and Seymour cashed in on this, the connection of the Ohio and Mississippi more to the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad than to the Erie. This is the main line of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad by 1860 from Baltimore to Wheeling and to Cincinnati. I can come in tight here. And after the Civil War, what really made B&O a good line for southern Indiana was the building of a bridge at Parkersburg, West Virginia. They also opened in 1870, 71. One at Bel Air, Ohio, near Wheeling, and then the Louisville Bridge in all of these things happened in 1870 or 71. And so the B&O line to Cincinnati, and then eventually they took over the line to St. Louis and got rid of the 6-foot gauge. That's a wonderful story of itself to connect to the B&O. In 1871, they set up on 340 miles of this railroad cruise every 5 miles. And at 4 a.m. on one day, they began work. And by noon, they had changed the gauge of the entire railroad from 6 feet to 4 feet, 8.5 inches, and then really became part of the Baltimore line. Now you see in Indiana, here's the Indiana part of that map, but between Lawrenceburg and Vincennes, from their point of view, there's really only one crossroads that the B&O cares about, and that's Seymour, because it connects directly to southern markets. And where's Mitchell, you say? Well, Mitchell doesn't even appear on the map, nor does the Moon Line Railroad. It's the Jeffersonville line that they like. And that's interesting and makes a big difference because it shows, because Seymour really is a very analogous place to Mitchell. Seymour has a relationship with Rockford on the White River, similar to Mitchell's relationship to Spring Mill. Rockford was an early crossroads town, had a mill. The difference is that Rockford's miller had a son who was a wheeler-dealer, politician, and real estate speculator named Needy Shields. And Needy bought land around here and became a founder of Seymour, in a way that Hugh Hamer never did with Mitchell. I guess it never occurred to Hugh that he should take over this process of deciding the railroad. But in Jackson County, they did. And it's a kind of story of individual just entrepreneurship in play here as well. A grandfather who was a miller who had a son who was a wheeler-dealer real estate speculator who had a son-in-law who was a good miller who brought the mill into Seymour. And he had two sons who became two of the most important millers in Indiana and nationally. And they were the Blish family. And they turned Seymour into a flour milling town in a way that Mitchell didn't become. Here's Seymour in 1878. And if I zoom in on that, this is their crossroads. It was the shops of the O.M. Railroad. And here's a flour mill. Right here, flouring mill. And that's the Blish mill that became one of the largest flour mills in Indiana. And by 1910, it was producing 1,000 or 1,200 barrels of flour a day, much of this being exported to Europe. And the grandsons were the ones who were the entrepreneurs here. And they, in fact, one famous episode during World War I is that in one shipment they exported nearly 18 million pounds of flour in one shipment to Europe for the Allies to use for foodstuffs during the war. 18 million tons in pounds, 18 million pounds of flour. And it was shipped out of Baltimore, and Baltimore became the connection that they were making to international sales. the railroads. This is a sales brochure of how many railroad cars are coming out of Seymour. So that mill lasted into the 1930s. It was hurt by the Great Depression. And I have another whole story that I can tell you or share with you another time about what the Depression and World War II did to milling in Indiana. But I won't tell it tonight. But this is a shot of the Blish Mills in Seymour after they were abandoned. That's what is left in Seymour today. So, because we're running out of time here, I think I'll leave it at that tonight and just let you know. I'll say one more thing here of where I could go with this, with Indianapolis, is here's a railroad map of Indiana in 1870, and Indianapolis becomes the real rail crossroads by the even as early as 1870s. I think this would be a good map to leave you with, where Indianapolis by this time already has 11 major trunk railroad lines that are crossing, including the B line, which I mentioned before. And it becomes a major milling center as well, which is a milling story that I tell elsewhere. Even today, Indianapolis has the 4th largest flour mill in the country, located in Beach Road. So if you're interested in a more detailed history of flour milling in Indiana, how it evolved from places like Beck's and Spring Mill into places that are producing millions of tons of flour drawn from all over the country and shipped to all over the world, I'll put you on to something that I've written about that. But I need to let you go now. All right, so about 1,800 acres.
1,358 acres.
Yeah.
That's what it is now. And I think it was 1,100 when it was first bought by the state. I mean, they've added just a little, not a whole lot.
It's a nice state farm.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. Before we let you go, you want to?
Yeah, any other questions? If not, thank you so much.
All right.